Hello, everyone, and welcome to the introduction to this special podcast edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkins, and I'm sitting in a windstorm here in North Dakota. It's fun to watch the wind blow the leaves off of the trees. It's that time of the year. I just finished a conversation with Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky about her book, Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic. A splendid book, and we had another spirited conversation. I did my best to defend Mr. Jefferson against her scurrilous and vicious attacks, but she batted them all away as if they were mere shuttlecocks in a badminton match. She's got the right stuff, and she's really, really good and funny. Tired right now because she has been so overbooked here in the last few weeks. She's got a big new job as the executive director of the Washington Presidential Library. And she also, of course, has got a book launch and is speaking all over the place and has been interviewed on media for the book and so on. So she's pretty tired, but that doesn't hold her back at all. So we talked about a number of things that are really interesting. First of all, how does a historian operate? And how do you write under the shadow of current events? So her book would not have been the same book if it hadn't been for January 6th, the attack on the United States Capitol, or not the same book if there hadn't been a crisis of transfer of power. That the book comes out of that crisis, and she wants us to know that John Adams was not flawless, but he did all the right things in the transfer of power from the first administration, Washington, to the second, the one-term presidency of John Adams. And then he did the right thing again, except for one little lapse on Inauguration Day, when Jefferson became the third president of the United States. So those things would have come up in her book no matter what, but they wouldn't have been emphasized to the extent that they are, except for the crisis of our times. And this is, let me just speak to this for a moment. You should read this book because at the end she does talk briefly but passionately about what happened on January 6th. And we all know what happened. Even those that pretend that it was something else know what happened, that you can't attack the Capitol of the United States to try to prevent the transfer of power, an election to be certified under the proper protocols of certification by the House of Representatives. Everybody knows this, and you can pretend that the election was stolen, but in their heart of hearts, they know what they were doing was dangerous, exceedingly dangerous to the continuities that we need in a Republican form of government. At any rate, that really informs the book. And now we're there again as we approach the 2024 election, and there will be a contested election, especially if Donald Trump loses. I don't think that the Democrats are likely to cry rigged election if Trump wins. Unless there is a meddling in the state certification process, which there might well be. I don't think there will be. Here's the point I want to make about this, and I hope that you listen carefully to this one. If this is where we are, that there's a legitimacy crisis for each new president, honest people are perplexed about whether the election was regular or irregular, that losers through sour grapes contest the results of a fair election. If we're not going to have concession speeches and an acceptance by the losers that they lost this time, maybe they come back and win next time, but that this is essential. The peaceful transfer of power is essential to a republic. If that is broken and can't, at least in the short term, be fixed, we're in real trouble. And if you read the work by Tim Snyder and Ann Applebaum and others, when peaceful transfer of power breaks down, that's the beginning of what can be the end. I don't think it will be, but it can be the end of a democracy. So this is serious business. This is not just political theater and great fun. This ruins lives, and it could ruin the republic. But if this is the case, then that means we have a failure of civic education. That's my point here. That if we understood what's at stake, we wouldn't let this happen. That millions and millions, tens of millions of people think it's some kind of a game, or that it's a zero-sum game, or that you win by any unscrupulous means you can, and that if you don't like the results, you just contest them and if necessary, go break windows and assault policemen at the United States Capitol. This is a failure of civics education. We've ceased to teach our young people what's at stake in a republic. They don't know the Bill of Rights. They don't even know the three branches of government necessarily. They don't know why peaceful transfer of power is important. They don't know the difference between the capital C Constitution, which is quite silent on many of these things, and the small c Constitution of norms, which have been in place for several hundred years. And by the way, that's the theme of Lindsay's book, that John Adams built in precedents that helped to forge the republic. How do you become the second president of the United States? Do you keep the cabinet of the first president? Do you consult the first president? Do you break with the previous administration? Do you set your own style? Or do you keep a cabinet? Do you have levees? Do you meet the public? And if so, in what way? Do you travel the country, as Washington did twice, once through the north and once through the south, in a kind of almost like an imperial progress that you would see in Great Britain during the Renaissance? What do you owe to your predecessor? What do you owe to your successors? What's your relationship with the capital C Constitution? And what's your relationship with the norms? And those norms needed to be set over time until they were set in stone. And frankly, we all were blindsided by what happened on January 6th, 2021. It was bad enough that the President Trump refused to acknowledge that he had lost the election. But it was infinitely worse when that wasn't just a bunch of political rhetoric and theater and actually became an armed insurrection of low level, admittedly. No guns were fired except by the police, and only once. But tear gas was sprayed, bear spray was sprayed into the Capitol Police, physical assaults were made, limbs were broken, suicides came out of this, permanent eye damage, deep psychological trauma, enormous property damage, and just think, what if they had gotten to Nancy Pelosi? What would those goons have done? What if they had gotten to Mike Pence? What would those thugs have done? What would they have done if they had gotten their hands on the Squad or AOC or liberals of any stamp? Jeremy Raskin, people like that. It's chilling. We dodged the bullet. We slipped the noose. Mike Pence not literally. Mike Pence slipped the noose. This is a failure of understanding of what a republic is. And that failure comes because we're watching reality television and Below Deck Mediterranean and the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City and sexual innuendo game shows and all the things that we do instead of ask ourselves, what does it mean to be a citizen of the United States in the 21st century? What are my responsibilities? What must I know? What must I understand? What are my duties to the continuity and survival of a Republican system of government? Those are regarded as silly, quaint, dumb, old-style geezer questions today because we're too cool to face the truth that we're in real trouble here. And so we need to do one of two things. We need to give up on the republic and let elites run things because the people aren't up to it. But that's not the Jeffersonian answer. The Jeffersonian answer is we need to get serious about public education and, of course, private education. But we need to get serious and teach our young people what it is to be a citizen of the United States of America in the year 2025. And we're not doing it, and it shows. And we are very close to collapse. We probably won't collapse, but we might. And if we do, it's because we lost the will to hold up the republic, to hold up the norms, the virtues, the decencies, the protocols, the civic engagement and civic commitment that's essential. And I'm really worried. And so her book is about John Adams, a kind of forgotten second-tier president of the United States, although she does her best to resurrect his reputation, and I think accurately on the whole, with a few cheap shots against Mr. Jefferson. But her book is also about where we are right now. And although she doesn't want to overemphasize that because that's not really the work of a historian, she wants to make sure she's careful about that, and she is very, very intelligent about the way she handles it. But it's there, and you can feel it. It's just as when I read books about the end of the Roman Republic, Tom Holland's Rubicon, which is about the end of the Roman Republic, which is a book I highly recommend, by the way. I kept saying, is he writing about them, or is he writing about us? And when you read Lindsay's book, you think, is she writing about that? Or in some sense, is she writing about us? Of course, it's both. And she handles it with masterful discretion and good taste. So let's go to the program. And before we do, let me say that we have a few openings in the Shakespeare Retreat for January of 2025 at Lochsa Lodge in Idaho, just west of Missoula. I think it's the 12th through the 17th of January, so you can go to ltamerica.org and see that, and sign up for our newsletter and follow along my Travels with Charlie Steinbeck tour. But the Shakespeare retreat begins on the 12th of January, and you fly into Missoula. We pick you up, take you to this magnificent retro resort in the snow, but it's not cold. It's beautiful and temperate. And we'll be looking at two of Shakespeare's greatest plays, one of his greatest tragedies, King Lear, and one of his greatest comedies, As You Like It. I think there are greater tragedies and comedies, Hamlet for tragedies and Twelfth Night for comedies, but these are two of the top 5 plays that Shakespeare ever wrote, King Lear and As You Like It, and they're both about many things, including Alzheimer's disease and dementia for King Lear. What is the succession plan when an old person is no longer fully in control of his capacities? Sound familiar? And the other question that comes up in As You Like It is about gender construction. What is a man? What is a woman? A boy actor playing female part, which was the case then. And then the female, to escape from tyranny, goes to the woods and dresses like a boy. So boy actor playing female lead, now pretending to be a boy in the woods. And then when she meets the man she really wants to marry, but he's kind of untried in the rites of courtship, she then says, well, I will pretend to be a woman and you can court me as a way of learning how to court the woman of your dreams. And so it's a boy actor playing a female lead, pretending to be a boy in the woods and then pretending to be a girl in the woods. And so talk about gender construction and the porousness of gender. Shakespeare was onto it, and this is the late 1590s or first years of the 1600s. So do come. We have the greatest time. They're always about the books, but they're also about the humanities. They're about life. They're about how we see the world and negotiate our way through it with good sense and humility and civility. And so they're life-changing, these retreats, and I hope you will consider signing up for one next year or the year after, but there are a few places on this one if you would like to come join us. So we'll see you there, ltamerica.org. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America, my second conversation with Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky about her new book, Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents that Forged the Republic. Lindsay, we had a spirited discussion with some of your fans on Zoom last night. I loved it. There were more than 200 that turned up, and they were really excited to have a chance to meet you and to hear a little bit about the process of writing a book, some of the themes of the book, your work as a historian, and everyone is thrilled, of course, that you are now the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon. So terrific. And I have lots and lots of questions that have come up, and we'll talk a little bit about Mr. Jefferson, but let me start with this. Let's do some John Adams 101, just on the assumption that not everybody is as deep in these historical reeds and weeds as we are. He, born in Massachusetts, became a lawyer, came to prominence by defending the British soldiers in the Boston Massacre.
Yes.
Went on to become one of the most important revolutionaries during the First and Second Continental Congresses. Fingered or pointed to George Washington to be commander-in-chief and Thomas Jefferson to write the main draft of the Declaration of Independence. Wrote the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, or not alone, but mostly. And then went on to be the Vice President of the United States. I'm leaving out his time in Europe as an important diplomat during the peace treaty period in the 1780s. And then became the second President of the United States. What am I missing there?
I think you did a pretty good job for the top bullet points.
And he married one Abigail Smith in 1764, October 25th. Probably the best decision that he ever made.
Agreed. By far his smartest position, because she was so instrumental to his success, his ability to be a diplomat, his ability to be a politician, to pursue the things he wanted to pursue, because so many people in his position had to leave office because their businesses or their farms at home would lose money when they were in service. And his did not. In fact, his thrived because of her care and her attention.
The emoluments for our public officers at that time were very limited, even for the President of the United States. Jefferson, for example, who was admittedly profligate, lost money, went into debt while serving as President of the United States. And I know from reading biographies of Adams, although this is not, I think, in your book, that there was a period when John and Abigail Adams were in severe financial straits, and their son, John Quincy Adams, stepped in to help them out, and then they were able to right the ship.
Yes, that's, I believe, in his post-presidential period. And at that point, John Quincy Adams did help with their finances, which is interesting because his son then did the same for him when he was in post-presidential life as well.
And, you know, John Quincy Adams, who didn't particularly like or admire Thomas Jefferson, at least as an adult, read Jefferson's correspondence when it was 3 volumes were published after Jefferson's death, and he got enraged again and again by Jefferson. But he did say it's unacceptable that we leave our former presidents destitute, that we must find ways to secure their finances, that they've served this country. It's not okay that most of the early presidents were, except for George Washington, were straitened in their finances following their service to the country.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and that was a sentiment that was echoed again and again. And I think it wasn't actually until Harry Truman, if I'm remembering my history correctly, that they decided to actually do something about it, because he was so poor in post-presidential life. And I mean, the idea was that a president should not go home and have a job. And I think, John Quincy Adams is sort of the exception where that was considered to be an honorable occupation. But you don't really want a president in like just an average ho-hum job, because that I think is kind of weird for a lot of people. But you also don't want them to feel that they have to make money in more corrupt terms. And, today most presidents write books once they leave office, but that's kind of the only, and maybe some speaking fees are considered acceptable. But even then, those people tend to raise eyebrows at ways that a president can make money.
I remember, I'm a little older than you, quite a bit older. I remember when Ronald Reagan left office and then took some very large speaking fees, not only from this country and around the world. And it wasn't a scandal, but it was disappointing to people to think that he would cash in. Well, that seems a little naive now. Now they cash in a much, much bigger way, and often sit on boards, particularly of nonprofits, but sometimes at Wall Street, and take exorbitant speaking fees and form PACs, and then write books for which they get advances that can never be repaid by the sales of those books. And so it's a little bit...
I do actually wonder, as an interesting sort of publishing note, because Obama's book was so successful, if he earned back his advance. Not that we would ever really know that, but it is an interesting thing to think through.
It's hard to imagine how many books you have to sell for a $16 million advance. I think yours was somewhat under $16 million, wasn't it?
By a significant margin.
But the next one will be $22 million. So
I actually, I know we're digressing here into the art of publishing books, but I would never want to have an advance that I didn't feel that I had a shot of earning out, because I think that would be so stressful. Not that I'm exactly cool-headed in the lead up to a book publication anyway, but I feel like that would add so much pressure to it, and it would just be this like specter that would be hanging over your book, because if you don't earn it back by a significant, if you don't come close to earning it back, you're not going to get a good deal in the future. So I would rather have a slightly lower advance and earn it back and then some, and not have to worry quite so much.
How noble of you.
I actually think it's very self-serving, but I'm glad you think it's noble.
No, it is noble, of course, because let's say someone offered you $5 million to write your next book, and you knew it's going to earn back about $750,000. You'd be giving away $4 million on the principle, and I get it that the pressure would be horrible, but on the other hand, people routinely do this.
Maybe if it was my last book, I will go all out, but when it's only my third book and I expect there to be more than 3, I feel like I would rather bet on the long-term success of my career than just one advance.
What a great question you have engendered here. As you look forward, you're young, so you probably have 5 more decades of active intellectual life, maybe more.
That seems fair.
How many books do you think you'll write in the next 50 years?
Oh my gosh, that's a lot of pressure.
10?
That would be a good goal.
That's a lot.
That would be a solid dozen, assuming that we're not counting like the edited collections, which are work, but they can be a lot of time, but it's a very different type of work. So assuming it's solo authored monographs, then yeah, I feel like a dirty dozen would be good.
There's a great book on the Federalist era, the 1790s, that we both love. It's a giant book. Would you be willing at some point in your career to write a history of the times, or is that not really your style?
Maybe. Right now, it actually feels less interesting to me, because the thing about that book is you have to try and include everything that happened in that time period. Now, obviously, they do leave some things out. You cannot, it's like physically impossible to include everything that happened on every day. But it's so detailed that I feel like it's much harder to tell a story. And I really like telling the story. That's a lot of the work that I find to be the most enjoyable. And to a certain extent, while that book does have personalities that come out, it really is secondary to what is happening in this decade or whatever. So it's possible I could fall in love with a decade and want to do that. But at the moment, it seems less intellectually interesting to me than trying to write a compelling narrative.
Agreed. So I'm going to ask you the biggest of all questions about your work, and that is, why did John Adams not get reelected in the year 1800? And I know that sounds like a simple question, but it is not a simple question. Why, when Washington had 2 terms, and John Adams was one of the greatest Americans, he had played a pivotal role in the Revolution, he was deeply and widely respected for his intellectual acumen and his advocacy of American liberty. Why did he not get reelected, do you think?
Well, I think there are a couple of possible explanations. One is structural, which is is important because it is, I think, the foundation upon everything else, the 3/5 clause.
We better explain it for the few who might not know.
Yes.
So you tell me if I've got it right, that one of the compromises made at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 about proportionment and representation, that every 5 slaves in the South would be counted as 3 for those demographic purposes and for taxation and representation and so on.
Yes, and so that did 2 things. It had inflated by substantial numbers Southern representation in Congress, and it inflated Southern power in the Electoral College. So that meant that the votes that were in the South counted for a whole lot more in the presidential election, and that was important because Southerners tended to support the Jeffersonian Republicans in much greater numbers than they supported the Federalists. So if we were to adjust those numbers to reflect only the population that was able to vote, for example, that would have looked quite different than it would have looked in the North.
But if the population of Virginia is, say, 2 million, and half of those are women, and women aren't voting or holding public office, I mean, there's a whole set of problems about representation that are not settled until the 20th century, right?
100%. So, I mean, the 3/5 clause was the first and most problematic element of representation, but it was definitely not the only one, because at the time, most of the states also had property requirements for voting. So even if you were a white man, if you were a laborer and you were very poor, then you didn't always have a guaranteed right to suffrage either. But I think that is a very important starting point, because it is helpful for us to remember the structural imbalance that was in place at the very beginning, just to situate ourselves.
Even in his own time, Thomas Jefferson was called the Negro president because he probably got over the line in 1800 because of the 3/5 clause, and it's plausible that without the 3/5 clause, John Adams would have been reelected. And so Gary Wills has written a book more recently called The Negro President. Excuse me for using that term, but it's a historical term in this instance. And it probably is the case, isn't it, that the 3/5 clause not only gave the South overrepresentation for decades, but it probably elected Jefferson in 1800.
Yes, I think so. So that is the first big reason, and there was nothing Adams could do about that. So it's worth acknowledging, but it is not one of the sort of political developments that could have changed on a campaigning decision, for example. The second reason that
we need to take a short. We need to take a short break. It's fascinating. We're talking about why John Adams wasn't reelected in 1800 to a second term. When we come back, we'll get your second, third, and fourth reasons for all of that. I'm speaking with my friend, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, splendidly now being celebrated around the country, including in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and elsewhere, as the author of Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to the special edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson, and across from me, virtually at least, at Mount Vernon, is my friend Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. We're talking about why John Adams was not reelected in the year 1800, and you gave sort of an interesting preliminary answer by saying, well, part of it was the 3/5 clause of the Constitution of the United States, and we get that, but that was a structural thing. Why else?
So this is my second reason is one that I think that a lot of historians have oversimplified. And it's really important to understand the full picture because it actually explains the political developments in more detail. A lot of historians have said, oh, well, the Alien and Sedition Acts were so unpopular that the American citizens turned against the Federalists and towards the Jeffersonian Republicans. And it is true that the Alien and Sedition Acts were unpopular, but Americans at the time did not see the Alien and Sedition Acts as something that was happening separate and apart from all of the other political developments. They saw them as part of a political system that critically the arch-federalists, which they really saw as exemplified by members in the cabinet and Alexander Hamilton, had implemented. And this entire system included the Alien and Sedition Acts, but also the massive expansion of the army, which there were rumors that this army was going to be used to quash domestic opponents, which Hamilton was thinking about, and the taxes that were required to pay for the army. These taxes were extremely unpopular. They were the first direct tax that was levied against American citizens. And just to explain what that means, is it is a tax that the American citizens have to pay directly to a tax collector, meaning the tax collector, in this case, it was on property. So the tax collector would come and assess your house, and based on the number of windows and the number of floors, would give you basically a tax bill. We all know how we feel about taxes today, and we don't have a tax collector coming to our house. Imagine how you would feel if you did. Americans back then did not like taxes anymore, and most of the Americans that had objected to this tax had also objected to the taxes during the Revolution. So the concept of having to pay higher direct taxes for an army to crush your liberties, which were attacked by the Alien and Sedition Acts, felt like an entire system that was designed to destroy the Republic. And that was what I really think undermined the Federalist Party, because it was so unpopular across the board. And Adams, interestingly, was not necessarily all that associated with some of those policies by a lot of Americans, but I think it led to such a displeasure with the Federalist process in general that really affected how the state legislatures worked, and that affected the Electoral College.
Yeah, so I think you're saying we have overemphasized the Alien and Sedition Acts as if they were in a vacuum and they were part of a package that was regarded as maybe quasi-oppressive by the American people. I get that, but let's just talk about those for a minute before we go on to your third reason that Adams lost the election. The Sedition Law was a very severe law. 26 people were prosecuted under it. They were all Republicans. No Federalists were prosecuted. Hamilton, for example, wrote really negative things about the Adams administration, but nobody decided to prosecute him for violating the technical terms of the sedition law. I think my view is Adams was not a zealot about this law, maybe even slightly uneasy about it, but Abigail was more of a zealot. And she's like, we need to make an example of some of these people. We need to stop this. These are unscrupulous people. They're ruffians. She's always a little more politically severe, I think, than her husband.
I think that's right. I think that she is more severe. I think the context, and the context should not excuse the severity or the prosecutions, because I think pretty much everyone agrees they were abhorrent and in direct violation of the First Amendment. But I do think the context is worth understanding where the fear came from, because that is useful. So at the time, there had been a great deal of political violence in the streets of Philadelphia, and that violence had come to the door of the president's house. It hadn't come into the president's house, but had come very close. There were not Secret Service at the time. There was not a gate outside the president's house. Threats were being delivered to the president's house about what might take place and threats to his life. Critical to a lot of that violence was language printed in the newspapers that actively called for said violence. That is important because today, our First Amendment rights, which we cherish, are actually restricted. We do not have a right to have protected speech that incites violence. That is an exception that the Supreme Court has carved out of the First Amendment. That was not recognized at the time. And so people regularly called for violence in the newspapers, and it seemed to a lot of people that those calls had great effect. And so that was the original idea behind the Sedition Act. It was just then implemented and used in a very political way to crush enemies.
Right. So nice try, my friend. But some were prosecuted for having maypole calendar, who was admittedly a horrible person.
It was utterly ridiculous. It just, I do think it's not like they were like, let's come up with a law out of nowhere for no reason to crush our enemies. I think it was this fear, and then they used it in the most political way possible.
You don't think that the law was designed to target the Jeffersonians?
I do. I think they left Jefferson out by design, and they had it expire at the end of the term by design. So I do think it was targeted to do that. I think that the original conversation about speech had a good faith-based concern. And the reason I bring that up is because I think there have been a lot of moments in American history where people start with a real concern that is grounded in actual events, and they allow themselves to become so convinced that the threat is so severe that any means are justified to crush that threat. And I think that that's what the Federalists did.
Fair enough. Jefferson said these laws were worthy of the 9th or 10th century, that they were fundamental violations, and that they were worthy of the 9th or 10th century, and that the Bill of Rights meant nothing if you can pass the sedition law, because free speech is only important to protect when it's dissent, when it's unpopular, when it's not responsible, when it's not establishment. That's exactly why you have the First Amendment of the Constitution, that it must protect obnoxious speech, and maybe not seditious speech, but speech on the road to sedition. And I think he was right about that. I think you and I agree about that. And if the law had not been sunset for the day that the administration ended, and if it hadn't been designed to shut the Jeffersonians down, in part at least, it'd be a lot easier. Or if Hamilton had been prosecuted for the crap that he wrote about John Adams. But of course, nobody was going to prosecute a Federalist, period.
Yes. So one of the other things that's important to note about the implementation of the bill, there are two things. The first is that, as with all sedition cases, in this law, truth was included as a defense. But how do you prove the veracity of a political opinion? It is inherently not provable because it's a political opinion. So that was one problem, that the established defense was very hard to actually use. The second was that the entire judicial system was stacked with Federalists. John Adams and George Washington had been the only presidents. They had appointed all the judges. They had largely appointed Federalist judges. They had Federalist marshals. The Federalist marshals were in charge of selecting the juries. They tended to select Federalist juries. And at the time, there was not a judicial code in the way that there is today. And so much of the conduct by some of the Federalist judges, some comported themselves with great dignity and honor, but some were extreme partisans themselves and did things in these prosecutions that we would be impeachable offenses today because they were so inappropriate. So it's not just the bill, it was also how the bill was implemented and prosecuted and how the cases went that made it such a travesty.
So the old view was that the Alien and Sedition Laws almost alone diselected Adams. You're saying, yeah, maybe, but it was part of a larger package of seemingly oppressive things that were being done, admittedly at a time of an international war scare.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's why often when I'm talking about the Alien Acts in particular, I really take pains to separate out the 4 bills that were actually included in that legislative package. It's the Naturalization Act, which made it harder for immigrants to become citizens, the Sedition Bill, and then 2 separate Alien Acts. One is important because we've had a bill like it on the books ever since, and it has been used in periods of wartime because it provides appropriate due process. So it is an appropriate bill because it allows for the president to deport people, but only after there has been a declaration of war and there is the appropriate due process. The other did not require a declaration of war and gave the president unilateral authority to remove people. Now, critically, Adams never used it, which I think is a really important fact because it was a really disgusting law, but he never used it.
That's when Jefferson decided, if the 3 branches of the national government are not going to check each other as they were meant to do, then we're going to have to check them in some other way. And he wrote the Kentucky Resolutions, which basically said, if the 3 national branches of government won't check themselves, then the states are going to have to interpose themselves and say that is not okay, at least within the jurisdiction of my state. People didn't know that Jefferson wrote those resolutions for a long, long time. It probably would have killed his political career if it had been widely known. So that's your second view. And let me just summarize that. Your first view was the 3/5 clause, which was structural and technical, although appalling. The second is that this package of things, the war powers, the new army, Washington coming out of retirement, the taxation, the direct taxation, and the Alien, Sedition, and Naturalization Laws. Seen together, they were seen as too much. What weight do you give that? Is that 60% of why Adams lost? Is it 20? Is it 90?
I would say like 60 to 70%.
Was he aware of that those overreactions probably cost him?
Yes. Absolutely, because when he was going back and forth between Philadelphia and Quincy and then DC and Quincy, he was writing about the prevalence of liberty poles and opponents to these measures. And critically, Abigail wrote to him when they had their tax collector system, and she was like, this is a terrible idea. This is absolutely absurd. So he knew about the opposition. He knew what it felt like to have the taxes. He saw the liberty poles. He spoke to cabinet members about his reluctance to raise taxes, to pay for the army. It was one of the reasons he was distrusting of the army, because it was so expensive and it didn't pay for itself. So he had a very well documented expression of concern about all of these things and every single one of the pieces.
All right, what's third on your list?
So the third and fourth, I think, the third and fourth are the final two, and I think they're intertwined because they contributed to one another. The third is that the news of the Treaty of Mortefontaine had not yet returned to the United States. And that was important because that treaty, one, did secure peace for the United States, but it validated John Adams' political judgment. It validated his willingness to fracture the Federalist Party. It validated his political courage. Without that validation, without the proof that he had been right, the lack of enthusiasm in the Federalist Party because of the split in the party, and that's my fourth issue, was significant. Had he gotten this result, had it been clear that it had been a victory, I think that split would have been a little bit smoothed over, not completely, but a little bit smoothed over in such a way that it would have been easier for him to win.
I know my John Adams not as well as you do, but I think that he wore this as a badge of honor. If I can't be reelected because I did the right thing and saved us from a war that was a war we should not be fighting, that if that cost me reelection, I'm okay with that, because that's what virtue in the Roman sense is. That's what political courage really amounts to. And if you do the thing that only will sell politically, you're probably not a man of real virtue.
Correct. I think that is very true. And he was willing and happy to be sort of unpopular if it meant that he was going to be able to, do the right thing. But I think he would have liked to do the right thing and also win if he could have helped it.
Oh. Is it true that, I do believe it is true, that when he talked about his legacy, what's my standing in history, central to that was, I sent the peace delegation to France and was able to avoid that war.
Yeah, he actually said that he felt like the treaty should be the thing that goes on his tombstone because right. It was one of his bravest acts and one of the best things that he did in his long, long career.
I love that. So if kind of bookending, as a young man, he defends the British Army in the Boston Massacre, a highly unpopular thing to do, but smelling of political virtue right to the nth degree, and somehow survived that because people sensed his integrity. Mm-hmm. And then at the end of his political career, he, in a certain sense, shoots himself politically in the foot by doing the right thing and is proud of that. So this tells you something about the character of John Adams. Whatever one doesn't like about Adams, and there are some things that one could list, his political integrity is almost unmatched.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that he almost always does, at least if he expresses a knowledge of what the right thing is, he almost always does it. And in the case where maybe history does not vindicate his judgment, I think he has the good sense and the bigness to be aware of that.
So in this 4-point analysis you have made of the reasons that John Adams was not reelected to a second term in 1800, you have not mentioned Alexander Hamilton. And of course, the popular wisdom on this is that Hamilton was undermining Adams, that he was the shadow president in New York, that he did everything in his power to poison the well on Adams, that he was miffed because Adams would not make the army do the work that it had been intended to do when the Quasi War fear came, and that then he wrote that terrible anti-Adams pamphlet, which was published, and that is a huge factor. So how large do you think the Hamilton factor is here?
Well, I sort of fold that into my fourth point, which was the split in the Federalist Party and the lack of enthusiasm in voting, which is using obviously modern parlance, but I do think accurately describes what was happening. By the time Hamilton actually published his pamphlet in October of 1800, a lot of people had already gone to the polls. And so I don't know how much impact it actually had on voting, but it was really just the last in a long chain of things that Hamilton had done to further the split, to exacerbate the tensions, to undermine Adams' support within his own party. I'm not electorally sure how much impact it actually had, because I'm not sure we have any evidence of an elector saying, well, I was going to vote for Adams, but now because of this, I am going to vote for a Republican instead. I don't think that that's how it worked. There's no evidence that electors voted for Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, who was the second Federalist candidate and not Adams. In fact, the voters tended to be pretty unilaterally for one party or the other. But I do think that the split in the party, and this is where the election was so complicated, because there was actually multiple overlapping layers of elections, because at the time some states permitted their states to determine the electors for that state through the state legislatures, which meant that whoever won the state legislature won the right to choose the electors. And so the split in the party undermined how Federalists did in those elections, which ultimately would have undermined how many states had the capacity or the ability to select Federalist electors. So I think that's where the impact was largely felt, and that was largely over the summer and the early fall. So to be sure, Hamilton had a role, but I think it can be better summed up as this broader party split and lack of cohesion behind one candidate.
Agreed. So 2 quick questions, then we'll take a break. Question number 1, I'd always thought, and I thought I had read, that Hamilton did not intend to publish that pamphlet, that Burr somehow, in his usual Burr-like way, got a copy of it and printed it. But I think you make the claim that Hamilton did want it to be printed for a small circulation.
Yes, so he wanted it to be printed for a select number of friends. But what was interesting is that the printing was not done secretly, from what I understand based on the research. That it was done and then sent to people or even advertised as available. And either he was being disingenuous about his shock that it made it to the newspaper, or extraordinarily naive, which is why so many of his friends warned him not to do it, because they felt like it would reflect very poorly on him, and it did.
Yeah, if that's my final question before we take a break, my sense is that however awful it was for Hamilton to denounce the sitting and incumbent president of his own ostensible party in a pamphlet, it actually did more damage to Hamilton than it did to John Adams.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it was the ultimate act of projection. And so, if you say, well, that person is corrupt, it kind of, or if that person is vain, or if that person is irascible, or that person is unpredictable, it really made Hamilton look like all of those things. And his friends told him as much afterwards, so they were pretty harsh with him about the repercussions of that publication.
Yeah, it's amazing that you quote in your book several of his closest friends saying that was really wrong. That is not good form, Alexander.
I really like that they kept those letters. It makes me really happy.
Yeah, indeed. I'm talking with Lindsay Chervinsky about her new book. We'll be back in just a moment. Stay tuned. Welcome back to this really interesting conversation I'm having with Lindsay Chervinsky about her extraordinary new book, which I very much hope you will buy and read, Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents, which forged the Republic. I want to talk about George Washington for a minute, because, you don't hold back. I know you're an admirer of Washington and a great admirer of John Adams, but you don't hold back when there's something that doesn't sit well historically with you. You talk about what happened with the army that Adams was, with Congress, creating for the possibility of a French invasion of the United States during the Quasi War. And he asked Washington to come out of retirement and to lead this army, and Washington then decided that he should choose his own officers, his own senior officers, and the lieutenant, essentially the person who would be doing the field work, would be none other than Alexander Hamilton of New York. And Adams despised Hamilton, but he also believed that there were Army protocols that needed to be respected, and there were officers who were much senior to Hamilton, and by putting Hamilton above them, this would create all sorts of problems, which it did, by the way. But then when Washington heard that Adams wasn't going to make Hamilton the second in command, Washington threw a really uncharacteristic fit, and he basically blackmailed Adams and said, if you do that, I'm out, and the American people will get this, and you see what the ramifications are going to be, Mr. Second President of the United States. This is not good form, and you say in the book this was one of George Washington's greatest lapses, not just because of his pride and his arrogance here, but because it was essentially a violation of one of the most sacred constitutional principles that in the United States the civilian authority must be supreme, and that the president is the commander-in-chief, and nobody, no matter how celebrated you are, whether you're Washington or Ulysses S. Grant or George Armstrong Custer or Patton or Eisenhower for that matter, has the right to overawe the civilian sitting president. And you're pretty strong about that.
I am. I think I want to make sure that whenever I am spending a lot of time talking about the contributions of a founder, that I'm not shying away from their flaws, because then I hope it gives me more credibility when I'm saying, here's what they did that was really quite remarkable, because I have demonstrated a willingness to call out their poor choices. And, I think with Washington, so much of the initial challenge was ultimately, yes, this threat he makes to resign, knowing what it would do to Adams, and that is a poor choice. But in the initial conversation, he really allowed himself, and I'm not sure how much of it was intentional or how much of it was unwilling or unwitting even, he allowed himself to be boxed into this position through the cabinet secretaries, because based on the evidence, it seems like when he was initially thinking about the order of the generals, he was not necessarily set on Hamilton. He didn't demand it. He didn't demand the right to appoint them. And it was through the careful machinations of some of the cabinet secretaries, through Hamilton, through their supporters, that they convinced him that this was essential, and then convinced him that he had to fight with the president about it, and that he had demanded the right to do so. And so I think it was a series of mistakes that, of course, would never have happened had they been in the same place and able to speak together one-on-one, face-to-face, but rather that these communications were taking place through intermediaries and through letters that allowed this system or the situation to percolate. And then ultimately he kind of throws down the gauntlet. And, to a certain extent, it demonstrates the unusualness of this moment, because no other former president has ever carried the same weight that Washington carried, would ever be the same threat that Washington ended up being. Washington would have never allowed someone else to make these choices when he was president, but he also would have never appointed someone who could challenge him as commander-in-chief, but no one could challenge him because he was so unique. So it just is a very bizarre situation. And usually when there is a situation that involves so many firsts, like this one does, he was so careful about it. And here I think he made some mistakes.
Yeah, it would not have surprised you, I don't think, if Washington had said something in his letters over long distances and long times of delay. But if he had said something like, well, that's really upsetting, I should be allowed to choose my lieutenants, after all, I'm George Washington, but I do understand that the president is the commander-in-chief and I must defer to him as I would expect anyone to defer to me, then we would be even more filled with praise for Washington had he upheld that principle, right?
100%.
The usual rap on Adams is that he's a great man, but there's a kind of a weird, almost comic ridiculousness about him with his ceremonial swords and his titles of nobility and so on. What do you think Washington actually felt and thought about John Adams? What was, if he were in truth serum, what would Washington say about John Adams, do you think?
I think he believed a little bit of that characterization. I mean, I do think that he had more respect for Adams than Hamilton did, because he would have respected independence. Independence of spirit and mind was something that Washington valued. I think that he probably, there was a certain condescension among the military men towards people who had not served in the military. Although Washington was very aware of the importance of diplomacy, was very aware of the essentialness of the treaties that Adams was responsible for, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think he did have respect for his service. He certainly respected him more than other people did at the time. They were not close, I think he would have probably said that he occasionally thought he was a little ridiculous too. But I don't think he would have said that about the ceremonial sword, because I think that he understood where that was coming from. I think that probably more in terms of like the titles and things like that.
Yeah, I agree with you. And of course, you said that these veterans, the inner cadre that formed the Society of the Cincinnati, for example, that they had a sense that they were the supreme band of brothers, and that those who weren't part of that didn't quite have the same status in the history of our revolutionary and independence movement. And I think they felt that more about Jefferson, frankly, than they did about Adams. And, Washington is said to have said at Valley Forge, where's Jefferson? And it's clear that Jefferson was never going to take a musket and wallow through mud at Valley Forge. There's a sense that Jefferson is not quite always there in the crisis. And that was, by the way, Theodore Roosevelt's rap against Jefferson, that whenever you needed to be in the arena, Jefferson was on the mountain. And I think there's some truth to that.
Wait. Theodore Roosevelt didn't think very highly of Jefferson's tenure as governor of Virginia?
Oh, here we go. So now that you brought it up, I was gonna leave you alone on this. I was not gonna bring this up because last night, you were like, oh, moi? Did I write that horrible thing? So Jefferson was twice for 1-year terms the governor of Virginia at the darkest moment of the war. And here's what you wrote. And when I read this, I thought, oh, Grasshopper, oh, Lindsay, come on. You wrote, quote, after 2 disastrous terms as the governor of Virginia, in which the British invaded the state twice and met little resistance, Jefferson retired with his reputation in tatters. An official inquest cleared him of charges of dereliction of duty, but the taint stuck. Now, let me just say before you try to defend this, that yes, it wasn't the best time in Jefferson's life, and yes, this sort of did follow him at times through the rest of his life, and he was accused of being a coward and so on, and it hurt him deeply, and he said that the disrespect he got from people like Patrick Henry and others wounded him to the point that it would never go away except in what he called the all-healing grave, and so on. And there was an inquiry, whether you can call it an inquest, I don't know, but that was I think, unnecessarily mean-spirited attack on Mr. Jefferson. Can't you just say this wasn't his best moment?
I think it's really funny that you did that whole lead up to it's a mean-spirited attack with all the things that you agree with me about in terms of the factual representation. And I'm delighted to hear that Theodore Roosevelt would have agreed as well, because I feel like that is a very good authority on a lot of things. So I'm good with that.
If Merrill Peterson were still alive, if Dumas Malone were still alive.
Oh, yeah. Dumas Malone was really the most balanced interpreter of Thomas Jefferson. Dumas Malone would have willingly licked the bottom of Thomas Jefferson's shoes after he walked through the stables.
I don't know why I love you. You're just so mean. You're just such a
but
mean.
But you do. That's the best part.
I do love this about you, Lindsay, but I actually, in all seriousness, look, I love to have fun with you and your unprecedented, vicious attacks on Thomas Jefferson, but I actually do think that went too far. I think you could have said something other than inquest. I think you could have said something other than tatters. After all, after that difficult moment in Jefferson's life, he goes on to become the minister to France, the first Secretary of State, and one of the greatest, the Vice President of the United States, the President of the United States, the founder of the University of Virginia. It wasn't in tatters. I mean, yes, there was some fraying of his historical reputation, but if ever anyone bounced back from that debacle, it's Thomas Jefferson. And keep in mind, my friend, that this was a really, really, really difficult time because the Constitution of Virginia did not give the executive much authority, and he had a council that was even more craven and cowardly than he was. Jefferson's not a warrior. I freely admit that. But I think I'll leave Dumas Malone out since you have him licking the boot of Jefferson. I think that any person with a reasonable respect for Thomas Jefferson would say, we love you, Lindsay. We love your book. That paragraph should have been toned down.
I think that if you recall correctly in the cabinet, when I give the biographical sketch, I'm actually quite defensive of Jefferson against the threats that it was his responsibility to defend the state of Virginia.
So which is it?
In this particular instance, author's privilege to have one spicy paragraph.
So, but we had this conversation last night with a group of 230 people who were wide-eyed in deep admiration for you. And you said that you stood by it, and I gave you just one lovely out. I said, Dr. Chervinsky, when you finished that paragraph, didn't you stand up and say, wow, I mean? And you said, no, I loved it.
Yes, I stand by the paragraph. You can think it's too harsh. That's fine. That's why we are both allowed to write books.
Okay, well, I can't, the littlest concession would have been, as they say, much appreciated, but still fine. All right. So I want to ask you about John Adams' writings, because he says to Jefferson in the magnificent correspondence that begins on January 1st, 1812, he says in his usual self-pitying way, "Why have I never been understood? I've written so much, and everyone sees me as a monarchist and a defender of aristocracy, and I don't know what's happened, but there's nothing I could ever do possibly in the world to be understood. I've been misunderstood from the very beginning. How could this happen?" And my view is, because you wrote that stuff. And it's not as if people made this up about him. If you read those documents, he does seem to be a little more comfortable with aristocracy and monarchy than you would expect for someone who was upset that people held him to those views.
Well, people clearly told him that he wrote too spicy of paragraphs too. So I'm sympathetic to John Adams.
I guess either you're tired or we've reached the end here. So, but do you think he's been unfairly? Is he unfairly pigeonholed as a possibly crypto quasi-monarchist?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think that he ever was interested in monarchy because he was a deeply devoted American and believed strongly in the importance of a republic. He did have admiration for the success of the British Empire and how long it had survived and the systems that it had put in place to allow its survival, but he was not trying to recreate it in the United States. He was conducting a study of what had worked or what had not. And if push came to shove, if he would rather have the anarchy of the French Revolution or the British monarchy, my guess is he would have said the British monarchy, but his entire life's project was trying to create a middle road. And so for the people who I think often misread him, it was regularly because they had cherry-picked a section from his book rather than looking at the entire picture, which perhaps was his fault for not editing down way too many words.
Do you think that he was willfully misread or that he just wasn't clear enough?
I think some people willfully misread him. They wanted to misread him. They were political opponents of his. In other cases, he could have been more clear. But I think that there are some people who criticized him who it would not have mattered how clear he was, because that's the nature sometimes of politics.
Do you think that Jefferson willfully mischaracterized Adams' views?
Sometimes, yes.
I think so, too. All right. Something in your book really, many things delighted me. Some startled me, but in a good way. And there were several things that really changed my views in an important way. And here's one. I'm quoting a letter from Adams to Jefferson on June 30th, 1813. You know this letter. This is the terrorism letter. And he says this, talking about that time in 1799 when he's president and he has a fast day and there are riots or threatened riots in Philadelphia. And he says this, that there were people that were going to drag Washington out of his house at an earlier time. And then he says, I have no doubt, this is my favorite line from the correspondence, I have no doubt you was fast asleep in philosophical tranquility when 10,000 people, perhaps many more, were parading the streets of Philadelphia on the evening of my fast day, when even Governor Mifflin himself thought it his duty to order a patrol of horse and foot to preserve the peace, when Market Street was as full of men as could stand by one another, and even before my door, when some of my domestics, his servants, in frenzy determined to sacrifice their lives in my defense, when all were ready to make a desperate sally among the multitude, and so on and so forth. And I thought, what a drama queen this guy is. What a drama king Adams. It turns out it's true. I mean, he may be overreacting, but he's not making this up, is he?
No, he's not. I mean, I do think it's quite likely that he probably exaggerated the size of the crowd that was outside because he was prone to do so. But the way that we know that it was nerve-wracking was that Jefferson wrote the day after the fast day that it was not safe to go outside. And so that is a confirmation that he was not totally making it up.
So I love this. And I think, if ever anyone understood Jefferson, Adams was one of those. He's not always fair, but he truly loved Jefferson, not just admired. And he loved him in spite of everything. And if he hadn't started, I don't think the correspondence in the retirement series would ever have occurred. But he does say, I think this gets Jefferson exactly right. I have no doubt you was fast asleep in philosophical tranquility. Doesn't that just nail Jefferson?
Yes, 100%. It's perfect.
I just love it because philosophical tranquility is the 38,000-foot level that Jefferson liked to be at when he said things like, the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with blood and so on. That Jefferson had this kind of serene view of the world. And Adams' view is essentially, you weren't there, my friend. When were you ever in a street? Ever been in a riot? And then he says, what think you of terrorism, Mr. Jefferson? Now, terrorism doesn't mean what we mean by it, but what do you think of mob action, Mr. Jefferson?
Yeah, well, and the answer, so if I'm recalling correctly, as you said, this letter was written in their retirement. And so while I think Jefferson downplayed it when he responded in retirement, as I said, the letter he wrote the day after the fast day, I think that letter was May 10th, 1799. If I'm remembering my dates correctly, he did not like it. He did not like being in the city when things occurred like this. He felt he was nervous about it too.
Yeah, exactly. And I love it that you showed that letter because, of course, it's essential evidence to prove that Adams was not just making stuff up here. I wish we had more time. We will come back to this, of course, many times, Lindsay. I know you're exhausted. You've had quite a whirlwind here and a new job, too. Are you on cloud 9, cloud 8, or cloud 10? You could not have anticipated, I think, that you would be in the Wall Street Journal with an image of yourself. I mean, the press has been fantastic, and it's just beginning.
Well, the Wall Street Journal one I actually knew about because I had to write that piece. The New York Times was the one that was a surprise because you just never, their reviews are so unpredictable. You just never know what's going to happen. And so that was a really wonderful surprise. And there's been some other media that's just been extraordinary to come in, and you always hope for it. You plan for it. I put out asks for it. I tried to make it happen. You just never really know what is actually going to respond. And so that is incredibly gratifying. And, I'm definitely on cloud 9, although I'm mostly just very tired. And so I am going to make sure I make an effort on weekends when I don't have a whole lot to try and reflect and make sure I'm appreciating the moments such that I do not let it pass me by.
1,000 heartfelt congratulations. You know, I've sent that offensive paragraph about Jefferson to Peter Onuf and to Annette Gordon-Reed and to Monticello, and I said, who will stop this puppy? Who will stop this puppy? And they won't even reply. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of Listening to America.